Hey class, Mr. Simpson here, and today we will be discussing the life and society of the Incas. The Incan Empire lasted from 1438 to 1533. Now, they may not seem like a large amount of time to you, which it's not on the timeline of life, but what was cool about this is that the empire covered Peru, Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Argentina, which, if you remember anything about your Latin American geography, is a huge tract of land. The Incan Empire was located in the Andes Mountains, and the Andes Mountains stretches from northern South America all the way down to southern South America. So that's huge. The Incan Empire exploded and became a huge force in South America. The capital city of the Incan Empire was Cuzco. And legends say that Cuzco was founded by the first Incan ruler, which was said, who was said to be descended from the sun god. However, when people talk about the Incan Empire, the city that they talk about the most is Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu is the best preserved city of the Incan culture, and Machu Picchu was lost to the world and was recently rediscovered in 1911. As you can see, the Incan Empire stretched from northern South America to southern South America. Okay, and this was a huge tract of land. And they also had a huge road system, which we will discuss later. Here's a picture of Machu Picchu nestled high in the Andes Mountains. As you can see, it's picturesque, very beautiful, a lot of fog, and just gorgeous architecture. And people today can go and visit this historical site. Here's a picture of Cuzco as it is today. Cuzco, it still has a little remnants of its Incan culture, but for the most part, it has been rebuilt. Society and classes of the Inca. Now, the upper class was made up of kings, priests, and government officials. These were all men, and it was the men who worked for the government. Women typically stayed at home and they took care of the house. Now, while the women were taking care of the house, the sons would go to school. This meant that the girls would typically stay at home with mothers to learn how to take care of the house. Upper class families had a lot of privileges that the lower class didn't. Upper class families, they had access to private schools and stone houses and the best clothes, whereas the lower class did not. The lower class was made up of farmers, artisans, and servants. There weren't any slaves in the Inca society, and if you remember anything about the Aztecs had slaves. The Incas did not, so there's a difference between the two. The lower class worked on government farms, they served in the army, they worked in mines, and they built roads. Most children in the lower class did not go to school, but instead learned how to farm or learned about their craft. The Sapa Inca was the title of the ruler of the Incan Empire. Yesterday, you learned about Atahualpa, who was the ruler of the Incan Empire. He was a Sapa Inca. And many people believe that the Sapa Inca was a descendant of the sun god, Inti. All men in Inca culture were required to give the government one season of physical labor as a tax. Now, this may not seem huge or very important, but this is what allowed the Incan Empire to explode and then to create huge networks of roads in the Andes Mountains. It was because men had to work for the government instead of paying a currency as a tax. Another thing about the government of the Incas were that there weren't any markets or merchants. People didn't go down to the town square on Saturday or Sunday to see what was being sold or to see what the deal of the day was. The government distributed goods and food. And it's very similar to a communist type of economy or command economy. Food-wise, the Inca grew more varieties of crops than any other Native American group. Potatoes were the main source of food for the Inca, and I'm going to discuss the importance of potatoes in just a little bit. Another important part of the diet was corn. Um, and as you remember from earlier this week, we discussed how corn was also an important part of the diet for the Aztecs. The Inca also grew tomatoes, peppers, strawberries, peanuts, squash, and beans. Um, the Inca, though, also ate some domesticated animals, um, including guinea pigs and llamas. And actually, our word jerky comes from the word charqui, which is dried llama meat. Technology. The Inca worked gold, copper, tin, and bronze. And while this doesn't seem like a big deal in regards to other Native American cultures at the time, this was huge. And that was because your Native American cultures, such as the Aztec, did not work with metal. Okay, if you remember, all of their weapons were made of wood or obsidian, um, whereas the Inca would use copper, tin, and bronze weapons. And the Inca was also fond of creating gold jewelry and jars en masse. Another cool thing about the Inca was that they used what's called a quipu. And this was a counting device made of string. And the government would use these quipus to keep track of how much time a person would work for them to pay off the tax. There were these little knots in the strings, and each knot represented a different number. And there were different colored strings, and each string represented a certain amount of time. So it was a very cool early counting device. Another awesome thing about the Incas was that they learned how to freeze dry potatoes. They also learned an early form of brain surgery called tray panning. I'm going to talk about both freeze drying goods and tray panning in just a minute. Another form of technology used by the Incas were llamas. They would use llamas to transport goods. And this is in direct contrast with the Aztecs, who didn't use animals to work. The Aztecs used slaves to work. The Incas used animals. Here is a description of how the Inca freeze-dried their food. We're going to talk about potatoes specifically. What the Incas would do is they would leave potatoes on the ground overnight in the cold mountain weather to freeze, very cold in the mountains. They would wake up and their potatoes would be frozen. So what they would do is then stomp on the potatoes to squeeze out the water. Then they would take this 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 potato and then soak it in water for a few weeks. Um, Finally, when it was soaked enough with water, they would dry them out in the sun. And what this would create was a potato that was very light and could last for several years. What they would do is they would keep these potatoes in storehouses in Cusco, their capital city, until they needed them. The government would distribute them in times of famine or just if a family needed some extra food. These potatoes lasted a long time. They were very easy to prepare. Okay, and these are very similar to what we use today as far as tater tots are concerned. Okay, so anytime you eat a tater tot, you just say thank you, Incas. Okay, one of the oldest known surgical procedures to man is called tray panning. Now, tray panning is when you cut a hole in a human skull, and they would do that to relieve pressure from an injury. Typically, these injuries would come from battle. If you can see here, it looks like this man sustained some type of hit to the head with a club. And when that happens, when you receive a head injury, either the fluid or your brain itself swells. So it needs to relieve the pressure, they would cut holes in the skull. Scientists today have evidence that people actually survived these surgeries and sometimes had multiple surgeries. Here down below you will see a video about tray panning. I highly encourage that you watch it. It's very interesting. Weaponry and warfare. Incas had a large variety of weapons. When it came to close range combat, Incas would use spears, clubs, stone axes, and a weapon called the macana. Now, the bacana was a wooden shaft with a heavy object at the top. Usually, this heavy object for the lower class soldiers were stones. However, for the upper class soldiers, the heavy object at the top was made out of bronze, some type of metal. Okay. Now, if you remember, like I said earlier, the Aztecs didn't use metal, so these weapons were highly effective. Um, when it came to long range combat, the Incas would use bows and arrows and slings, but they would also use what is called a bola, which was 2 or 3 stones tied to the end of a rope, and this weapon could be swung around the head and then thrown. And what it would do is when it would hit an enemy, typically you would throw it at an enemy's legs. So what it would do is it would wrap around the enemy's legs, tripping them up. It also was very effective in causing head injuries. Um, when it comes to armor, soldiers of the lower class used wooden shields and wooden helmets. However, your generals and your officers wore copper helmets. To protect the chest and the back, soldiers wore cotton tunics. Okay, and a tunic is a heavy padded shirt. And what they would do is they would stuff wooden plates in these tunics to add protection. Here's a picture of some lower class warriors. As you can tell, they're using wooden shields. That's how you can tell that they were part of the lower class, that they didn't really hold a rank. Here we have a sling, which would propel a rock. Here we have a macana. Here's a macana. And then here you see the tunics. Okay. Now these were not very effective against Spanish weapons. However, here on the right hand side of the screen, you have upper class warriors. Here is an Incan general. As you can tell, his helmet is made out of copper. Has a spear. Looks like he has a spear with a metal tip. So these were a little more effective. However, if you notice, not a lot of chest and back protection. So this would not afford the protection needed to survive against the Spanish steel. I've attached a video about Inca weaponry. Check it out, it's very interesting. Religion. The Incas, just like the Aztecs, worshipped many gods and goddesses. However, the most important gods were their sun god Inti and the god of nature. And I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this name. The god of nature. I'm not even going to try, guys. Another thing about the Inca is that they also worship sacred places or things called huacas, and these huacas typically were huge rocks, and villages, etc., would spring up around these huacas. Okay, though the Incas did not sacrifice people on the number scale that the Aztecs did. Remember, the Aztecs would sacrifice sometimes hundreds of people a day. The Incas would sacrifice and mummify children, typically for religious purposes. I've attached a video down here of a group of scientists who discovered a mummified child in the Andes. And they do a lot of cool forensic science to determine what happened to this child. Very cool. I highly encourage you to check it out. As far as architecture and engineering goes, the Inca were very, very advanced. Just as advanced, if not more advanced, than the Aztecs. The Inca created a huge system of roads that stretched over 12,000 miles. It covered a large part of the Andes, which is a huge feat for the time, considering that they lived in mountains. And since they lived in mountains, they needed to figure out a way to get over gorges. So what they would do is build what are called suspension bridges. And these suspension bridges were made out of huge cables made of woven reeds. And I'm going to show you a really cool picture of that in just a minute. The Incas also perfected the art of terracing. What they would do is carve huge steps of flat land up the side of a mountain. And these were used for farming and to also reduce erosion from rainwater. And just like the Aztecs, the Incas created aqueducts to provide fresh water to their cities.